Hello, everybody. It is September 14th, and today we're going to do a little bit of talk about John. I know Vic has been talking about John for a week or two. Today we're just going to continue down that same path, and we're going to talk a little more specifically, uh, perhaps about First John, the first of the little epistles that we believe the Apostle John authored. Our introduction will be specific to that particular epistle, but it also applies indirectly, at least, to Second and Third John as well. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I hope you guys are all having a good week. The weather is awesome. I know it's a time when we get busy. There's a lot of things to do outside. It's a great time to do outdoor projects, work on the lawn and those sort of things. So hopefully you're doing well with your health and doing well with those projects, and you have a little bit of time to listen to a conversation or discussion about John. So let's get into it. One of the unique things about John's writings is they are most likely the latest writings of the New Testament. Most of us know that John was the one referred to as the aged apostle or the aged elder, and that he outlived the rest of the apostles, the rest of the disciples. John lived almost to the end of the first century, probably died right around 98, 99, perhaps even later. The rest of the guys were all pretty much gone by 50, 60 AD. So he outlived them by 30 to 40 years. And so his perspective on some of these things comes from a guy who has watched the gospel now develop and spread and travel for the last 50 to 60 years, since Jesus probably died around 30 AD. So, we're almost 70 years post cross and post the resurrection. And so John's able to give a perspective of some things that are unique to John. And it looks like he did all of his writings, the three epistles, the gospel, and the Revelation, all around the same time, all around somewhere between 85 to 98 AD. John was in Ephesus at the time of his writings. So he's writing with, like I say, a little bit of historical hindsight that some of the other authors don't have. We're going to talk a little bit about Ephesus and its location and the significance of that. But before we go there, let's just give a little bit of time to why is John writing? Why is he even addressing the things he is, and what's his goal? What's he trying to do? And what we discover is that being in Ephesus around 90, 85 to 90 AD, he's there 40 years after Paul was there. And what we find out is that there's some mixed up or messed up doctrine trying to creep in to the doctrines of the church, into the gospel story. And I mean, it doesn't take too much of an imagination to think about how that might have happened, or why, or that it is happening, knowing the way humans work and the way opinions fly. We have 30, 40 years now for people's opinions, their traditions, their philosophies, all of those things to start creeping into the message that's being circulated by Christians. There are no New Testament scriptures yet. They have there's letters of Paul that that can circulate around, but there's no New Testament that's been compiled and all the writings put together for uh, certainly for circulation. Even if somebody did compile them, trying to make copies of it and get those out for public use was a major challenge in the first century. So they just didn't have that. So you got all these stories being told, all these um, deviations from the gospel, and it becomes very hard to know, like, well, what's right and what's not right. And so one of the things John is doing here is he's trying to give some measuring rod. He's trying to give some standards by which the church is able to distinguish between truth and heresy. And so he makes some pretty black and white, dogmatic kind of statements. It's just, look, it's either A or B. You're either part of the A group or you're not. And, oh, by the way, you're a liar and a deceiver and shouldn't be trying to promote what you're promoting. So he gets he gets pretty frank, if you will, pretty blunt. We know that one of his goals in writing is to guard the church. We have an elder apostle here who has a strong pastoral care and heart towards the church. And so he says, for example, in chapter 2 of 1 John, in verse 26, he says, these things I have written to you concerning those who are trying to deceive you. So right there we can see his goal is, I want you to have something solid that you can use as a measuring rod against these deceiving doctrines, against the people who are trying to come in and tell you they have new revelation from God, new understanding. And here we are to tell you, to give it to you, to give you the latest wind of doctrine, the latest thing to spring up in the church. How are those things to be measured? Well, John says, well, here's some ways to measure those things. You and I today, fortunately, we can put a New Testament in everybody's hands pretty easily. There's no shortage of Bibles. For many years it's been the number one published and distributed book, beating all of them by far. And so we can turn to the New Testament. We should not be deceived as easily as even first century Christians were, because we have the scriptures and we can check everything or measure everything against our New Testament. And it's a little puzzling, a little discouraging perhaps, why so many doctrines come through the church. It is almost as if we're always looking for the latest, greatest revelation, the latest prophetic word, the latest thing to come through the church. And, it seems like there's always a major movement towards something, and then it passes, like many things have just come and gone. And, Paul makes comment about not being moved around by every wind of doctrine, is that Paul? Perhaps that's James. We're just talking about not being so easily distracted, not being so easily moved by the latest wind to blow through the church, the latest revelation. Well, that's kind of what John's doing for his people in the first century. We can see his pastoral heart. He says in chapter 3, verse 7, he refers to the people he's writing to as little children. He says, little children, make sure no one deceives you. So right there we see he considers the people his children in the faith, and he has a love for them, and his goal is, I don't want you to be deceived. I don't want somebody to come along and rob you of the truth and perhaps rob you of your eternal security. We'll get to a verse along those lines in just a minute. But with John, we also see his fatherly, protective heart coming out. The people, he speaks out against the ones who are bringing these false doctrines. And in chapter 4, verse 1 and 2, he talks about not believing every spirit. Don't believe every wind that comes through the church, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. So he calls these adversaries false prophets. In other words, they're speaking by a spirit other than the spirit of Jesus. And they're being led by falsehood. Falsehood teaching and speaking spirits are speaking through these people. And so John refers to them as false prophets. And we already read chapter 2, verse 26, where he really refers to them as deceivers. He says, don't let them deceive you. And in his second letter, in verse 7 of that letter, he says, many deceivers have gone out into the world. Those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. And that will make more sense to us in a little while as well. But the point here is that John is not afraid to call these people out as being false prophets or being deceivers. And in chapter 2, the first letter, going back to the first letter, in chapter 2 of the first letter, he says that there's many antichrists who have gone out into the world. Let me just turn there quickly and read that. 2:18, he said, children, it is the last hour. And just as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, even now, many antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not really of us. For if they had been of us, they would have remained with us, but they went out. So he's calling them false prophets, deceivers, and antichrist. People who used to be part of the faith, people who used to be part of us, are now categorized as antichrist because they went out seeking their own thing, if you will, and embraced some falsehood. Now they're going out into the world trying to deceive others. And so John, when you're calling people antichrist, deceivers, and false prophets, you're not really mincing words. He's being pretty direct. So we can see this is, Vic pointed out that John and his brother James were the two apostles who wanted to call fire down from heaven to consume a Samaritan village for not allowing Jesus to walk through it. So he's, they were referred to the sons of Zebedee or the sons of thunder because there was something in John that, frankly, that I understand. That you just sometimes want to call fire down out of heaven and consume people for being, how can I say it, for being wicked? I don't know, whatever the word is. I'm not trying to be mean here, but I understand John's heart sometimes, especially when you see people who are bringing deception into the church and looking at some teachings that you know um, are going to shipwreck people's faith somewhere down the road. I was really not a fan of the prosperity message when it was so prevalent in the church through the 70s and 80s, and the message was telling people that, God wants you all to be rich, healthy, rich, and wise, everything. Everything that your flesh could possibly desire, Jesus wanted you to have it. You should never be sick. You should always have money, you know, so on and so on. Um, that was being clearly taught to the church for a couple decades, probably. And I'm happy to say that it's kind of gone by the wayside to some degree. But my concern was that this doesn't work. It's not the gospel message. It's not what Jesus taught at all. He taught that you give up things to be his disciple, that you embrace the cross the way he embraced it, and that you suffer the loss of all things so that you can gain life with him. There were no promises, and people are holding on to these things and crossing their fingers and crossing their toes, believing that I'm going to be healed or I'm going to be wealthy, and if I just send money to this guy or that guy, God promises to give me back tenfold what I sow, and it doesn't work. And so people get disenchanted with the gospel, with the Christian message, and their faith ends up being shipwrecked. I've talked to several people over the years who have made comments to me like, I don't want to be a Christian. I tried it and it didn't work. Well, maybe they were not ever a real believer. I don't know. But the damage is still the same. They are wounded. They are not open to at least what their perception of Christianity is, because they've been there and done that and found out it doesn't work. So false doctrines, false teachings do great harm to people's eternal security, great harm to some people who are actually in the church and are told these things by people they trust, only to find out that they were deceived. And it doesn't work. So I can be like John or like Paul sometimes and say, I wish you'd go off and just mutilate yourself, the way Paul put it. And John's just not afraid to call them. These are false teachers. They're false prophets. They're not speaking by the Spirit of Jesus. So I don't want you to be deceived by them. You're my children in the faith. I don't want that. I wish they'd go somewhere else and leave you alone. And so you kind of see that pastoral heart and that protective heart coming out in the Apostle John. Let's talk about the philosophies of the day and why were they being deceived. And I don't really want to get into the nitty gritty of the philosophies necessarily. We're going to a little bit because it helps us understand some of the comments that John makes. But that's not really as important to us, or the philosophies of that time are not really as important to us as the mechanics, perhaps, of what happened and what was John trying to do and how did he try to do it? How did he try to stand against heresies, if you will? And, it gives us some insight into some of the heresies that we're standing against, the philosophies of our day. It creeps into the church. It creeps in, we have a whole new philosophy today on what's morally acceptable and what is not. And those cultural and social philosophies creep into the church, and it certainly has today. Does somebody take a stand and say, look, these moral principles that you're embracing and even promoting are not of God. They are not of the Spirit of Jesus. Dare we say that the people who are promoting the idea that some of the activities of today, some of the how do I want to say this? I'm trying to be careful, as you can tell, but some of the gender issues and the sexual issues of our day, some of the teachings that the church is actually embracing and promoting. Would it be okay if we said they're false doctrines? They're false teachers. They're deceivers, deceiving people, and perhaps even antichrist because they're speaking by a spirit that's not of Christ. It's a tough stand to take, but the point is John was not afraid to do it. Paul was not afraid to do it. And at some point, you and I may have to do it if we haven't already. So you had the philosophies of John's day. I think some of it probably started with Plato. Plato was one of the Greek philosophers, and he taught a difference between the physical world and the spiritual world, or the unseen world was probably more the way he would have said it. And just taught many things concerning that. And then there were a group of people called the Gnostics who perhaps took that idea even a step further, and they said, well, everything that's physical is evil, and only the things that are spiritual are good. So all physical matter is just characterized as evil, including the human body. It's just part of the evil physical world that's around us. And so our goal is to kind of transcend the physical world in a way and move or gravitate more towards this unseen world or the spiritual world. And the Gnostics created a tension between the two, between the spiritual and the physical. And they believed that the way to ease that tension or to overcome that tension was to move towards the spiritual realm or the unseen realm through special knowledge, or gnosis, the Greek term gnosis. And thus we get the term Gnostics from those who believe that this gnosis, this special knowledge, would help them move away from the physical and towards the spiritual, or in other words, move away from evil towards good. And this gnosis came by special revelation, came by intuition, just an internal knowing. That makes me think of people who, Christian and non-Christian alike. I just hear people way too often say, well, I just think this, or I just, you ask them, well, why do you think? Well, I don't know. I just do. I just believe this. I just think this is the way it really is. It's like, well, how are you getting that? How are you arriving at those places of belief? Well, I don't know. I just do. I just know. And this is what scares me about Christians saying, well, I'm just going to read the scripture and just let you know what I think it means. Like, well, how are you going to arrive at that? You got some special gnosis? You got some special understanding that's just going to let you know things? And this is what the Gnostics kind of thought. They just arrived at these special revelations or intuitive ideas that help them move away from the physical and towards a spiritual world, from move away from evil to good. And these ideas started to creep in to the church. This is happening in Asia. John is in Ephesus, which is part of Asia Minor. This is the western third of the continent of Asia. Around 133 BC, or roughly 138 to 140 years before Jesus is born, this landmass that we think of as Asia Minor became a Roman province. The last king of Pergamon, which used to control this land, bequeathed the land to Rome upon his death in 133 BC. And so the whole area became a Roman province, known as Asia Minor. The capital of this province used to be in Pergamum. It was later moved to Ephesus. You might recognize Pergamum as being one of the cities that had a church in the book of Revelation. In fact, all 7 of the churches that are addressed by letter in Revelation 2 and 3 were in this landmass known as Asia Minor. And so John is right in the middle of all 7 of these. When he's getting his revelation, the churches that he's writing to are not some strange places that he may or may not be familiar with. I'm sure he was quite familiar with all 7 cities, all 7 churches. And so he has great concern for them. And you can kind of hear it in the letters. I mean, the letters are sometimes very corrective, telling, the Spirit of Jesus would often tell the church, I like what you're doing here, but I don't like what you're doing over there, and you need to change that. You need to correct it. And we know the Scripture tells us the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. So the book of Revelation is somewhat subject to John's spirit. It's going to have John's handprints on it, and it's going to have a flavor of the apostle. So those letters will have a flavor of John in those. And again, I think you can see both sides of John. You can see the caring side, encouraging the churches. I like the way you're doing some things. But then you see the fatherly side, or the corrective disciplinary side, saying, but you need to fix this, otherwise Jesus is going to remove your lampstand and you're no longer going to have a church. So that's just an interesting, something I think is fascinating to think about, that that here we have this apostle who's living in Ephesus, writing the revelation to the churches that are all around him, and he's acquainted and familiar with all of them. So he's doing this around 95 AD. Paul, 40 years earlier, had been in Ephesus. We know from Acts 19 that Paul was there. We know from history that he was there probably from late summer of 52, and he stayed for a few years until the spring of 55 AD. Acts 19 tells us that he was there for a couple years teaching in a school of Tyrannus, and that the result was everybody in Asia heard the gospel. That's what it says in Acts 19:10. That during Paul's stay there, he was there long enough that everyone, it's probably a little bit of hyperbole, but what it says is everyone in Asia heard the gospel. And so Paul evangelized this Roman province, Asia Minor, about 40 years before John ends up writing letters back to those churches, telling them, look, here's some things that you guys are doing well, but here's some things you need to change. In Acts 20, verses 29 and 30, I'm going to turn to that real quickly and read that because I think these things add some neat insights into the story that we're really looking into, the letters that we're looking into. Acts 20, verses 29 and 30. Paul is giving his farewell address to Ephesus in Acts 20. He's been there for the 2.5 years. He's getting ready to leave. And he says, I know that after my departure, savage wolves, these are the guys that, that John calls Antichrist, false prophets and deceivers. Paul's willing to call them savage wolves. They will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves, men will arise. This sounds like the ones that John says, hey, they used to be part of us, but now they're not anymore. They went out from us, seeking their own agenda, seeking their own will. Well, Paul says it a little bit differently. He says, from among yourselves, men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. That's the way Paul describes it. Acts 20, verses 29 and 30, he's warning the elders of Ephesus. After I leave, this is what's going to happen. Well, guess what? It did. By around 61 AD, Paul, writing a letter to his child in the faith, Timothy, says in 2 Timothy 1:15, says, everyone in Asia has turned away from me. So roughly approximately 6 years after he was there, evangelizing the region for 2.5 years, 2.5 to 3 years, 6 years later, even with a warning, even after warning them that deceivers will come up and try to draw you away, the conclusion is 6 years later, everyone's turned away. So, oh man, it just shows something about the human heart that's not fun to see. Historically, we know, the evidence shows us that there was an immigration of Christians back into this area just prior to the Jewish War of 66 AD. Now that's the war that got started over there that ended in 70 when Rome finally just came in and said, okay, we've had enough. And after 3.5 to 4 years of fighting with the Jews, they just Pompey came in and said, we're done. We're done with you guys. He just leveled the city, tore down everything, the temple, everything. Just put an end to it. But right before that, I guess the writing was on the wall a little bit. Jesus had warned people and said, look, when you see these things aligning themselves, get out of Dodge. Get out of here. Because it's not going to be good. He was given a warning in Matthew 24 and 25, and I think some of it was his warning about what was going to happen in just a few short years, well, a couple decades after he was done. But he in response to a question from his disciples, it's like, actually a statement, he says, Lord, they're telling him as they're walking out of Jerusalem, Lord, look at all these fantastic buildings and everything. Don't you think they're pretty cool? And his response was, well, I got bad news for you. Every stone here is going to be torn down. Not one stone will be left on another one. And I think he probably was prophesying or forecasting the destruction of Jerusalem. It just had to happen. And he said, when you see these certain signs taking place, you see someone setting themselves up in the temple to be worshipped and various other signs, it's time to go. Well, apparently some Christians took that to heart, they started evacuating Jerusalem, and some of them went up to Asia Minor, up into that area, and they sort of resettled the area and brought the gospel back with them. We know from historical evidence that Philip and his two daughters were among the immigrants. And this is probably the time when the Apostle John first went up there, moved up there as well. History letters from Polycarp and people like that tell us that Philip and his daughters and John were all buried in Ephesus. So that pretty much goes to suggest that, you know, they were there and lived there and died there. A variation of Gnosticism, the philosophy we were just talking about, started developing with the influx of Christians, the influx, you know, just with the time that goes by. There was a guy named Cerinthus that was promoting some doctrines still based on or built upon this idea, this tension between the physical and the spiritual, and Docetism developed, which took Gnosticism maybe a step further and actually taught that anything physical was evil. Therefore, God didn't even create the earth. The physical creation can't be from God because it's evil. And Jesus could not have been a human being because a spiritual God would never be identified with or embrace a physical body. And so Jesus didn't really come in the flesh. He came as an aberration, if you will. He was just a mental representation of a real person. You know, he kind of was ghostly or a phantom in a way, and they were denying that Jesus ever really appeared or took on human qualities and existed as a man. So these kinds of philosophies and were perverting the gospel and creeping into the church. And so therefore you get John making a statement like he does in chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. We've kind of read this, but listen to it again in light of that little bit of information. He says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God." Sorry. "Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. And by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God." So you can see there that he's refuting these heresies that are coming out of these philosophies that I think can be traced back to Plato's understanding and distinction between the physical and the unseen, and just developed further by various groups to the point where they finally say Jesus wasn't human at all. And John is saying everybody who says that's not from God. That's a false spirit. That's fake. John, you can kind of understand too, he gets polemical or combative right from the very beginning of his letter. In chapter 1, verse 1, he'd given the people an idea of what he's going to write about. And he says, it kind of goes back to his doctrine and his gospel. When he talks about the Word was God and the Word was with God in the very beginning, meaning Christ. But in his epistle, he says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we looked at, and we touched with our hands. concerning the word of life. This is what I'm going to write to you about. These are the things that I'm writing about. I actually touched Jesus. I actually handled him with my hands. I saw him. I watched him eat. I leaned back on his chest. He was not a ghost. He was not an aberration. He was not a phantom. I touched him. And so you can see he's coming out right away speaking against these doctrines, these these heresies. And he wants the people to know Jesus was real. He was um, every bit, everything that we have taught you, every bit human, and yet every bit the Son of God. And don't let anybody deceive you. In chapter 5 of 1 John, in verse 13, he says, I'm writing these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know you have eternal life. See, again, he's concerned about their salvation. He doesn't want them being deceived. He doesn't want somebody coming in and telling them, with a new doctrine or a new theology about Jesus. So John's argument is, anybody who says these things is not from God. I touched the man. I knew him. I spent years with him. Anybody who says he wasn't a person is a liar. They're just not telling you the truth. In chapter 4, verse 3, he continues with those thoughts we just read, and he says, every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. Again, there's a measuring line. He's just putting it out there dogmatically and very clear. If they don't say Jesus came in the flesh and they don't confess Jesus as the Son of God, they're not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming and now is already in the world. So we can see this aged apostle, this man who outlived everybody else, has a little bit different perspective. He has 40 years on Paul, 30 years on his life probably. He has a different perspective. He's watched the churches come and go and come back again. He's watched these doctrines creep into the faith, and he's addressing those issues. He's being like a father to those around him. And we know from the writings of men who studied with him, like such as Polycarp, that they greatly admired and esteemed the Apostle John. They make comments that I would rather sit and listen to him talk than read any book, because of what he knows and what he's able to relate to us. And so we should be blessed and thankful that this man gave us these 3 letters, and gave us his gospel, and gave us the book of Revelation. God used him, kept him alive long enough to give him that perspective, and then used him to write these letters. So that's a little bit of background on on the man John, and specifically regarding First John, and what's he trying to do here? Why is he writing the way he does? And I hope it blesses you guys. I hope you can gain something from it that's useful. I think it's appropriate, applicable to our day, and it's kind of fun to look at these things and try to give application for them. With today's philosophies, today's situation, today's problems, today's blessings, how do we use the scriptures in a way that helps us today? It's good to know the history. It helps us understand John was doing, but it's also good to try to look at it and say, how do we use it to benefit the church today? So with that, I'll quit. God bless you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll see some of you on Sunday, and the rest of you uh, be blessed by your gathering, and hopefully we'll talk to you all soon. Thanks.